No, officer. I'm Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, United States Marine Corps.
This is my car.
And you're about to make a mistake that could end your career.
Cop accuses Black Marine for stolen car. Seconds later, he flashed her ID and ended his career. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams pulled into the parking lot of the Quantico Marine Base Exchange at 1400 hours on Friday afternoon, his pristine midnight blue Dodge Challenger drawing the attention of Officer Jennifer Hayes, who was convinced she'd finally caught a car thief red-handed. In 90 seconds, when Marcus revealed his true identity, her 20-year law enforcement career would be over. Marcus, 28, appears to be exactly what Officer Hayes expects from her racial profiling training, a young Black man driving an expensive car that obviously doesn't belong to him. But beneath his civilian clothes lies a decorated Marine Corps intelligence officer whose security clearance and military connections will transform a routine traffic stop into a career-ending disaster. What happened in broad daylight outside a military installation would expose how racial bias can blind law enforcement to their most catastrophic mistakes, and how one officer's prejudice collided with the wrong target at the wrong time. Quantico Marine Base Exchange parking lot, Virginia, a bustling commercial area serving thousands of active duty Marines, their families, and authorized personnel with base access. The facility operates under strict security protocols, where every individual has been background checked and cleared for entry to one of America's most secure military installations. The civilian-military interface creates unique law enforcement challenges. Local police patrol public areas adjacent to federal property, creating jurisdictional complexities that require officers to understand military culture and protocols. Many Marines shop in civilian clothes, making their military status invisible to untrained observers who might mistake them for ordinary civilians. Recent tensions between civilian police and military personnel have increased due to high-profile incidents of racial profiling affecting service members. This setting represents the dangerous intersection where civilian prejudices meet military authority, creating situations where officers' biases can trigger conflicts with individuals whose actual authority exceeds their own. Marcus enlisted in the Marines at 18 straight from high school in Detroit, rising through intelligence ranks through exceptional performance and strategic thinking that earned him rapid promotion. His specialized training in counterintelligence and threat assessment provided him with psychological insight into profiling and discrimination patterns. Marcus's rise to Staff Sergeant at 28 reflected extraordinary competence in analyzing adversarial behavior, skills that extended far beyond military applications into understanding civilian prejudices and their tactical exploitation. Marcus serves as intelligence analyst for Marine Corps intelligence activity, holding top-secret SCI clearance that requires extensive background investigation and continuous monitoring. His work involves threat assessment and counterintelligence operations requiring absolute discretion and professional behavior under pressure. The Dodge Challenger represents his only major purchase after years of saving military pay, chosen specifically because he'd earned the right to own something nice. Marcus lives on base, maintains security protocols even off-duty, and documents interactions that might affect his clearance status. Despite his young appearance, Marcus possesses extensive training in psychological operations, threat assessment, and behavioral analysis that enables him to read people's motivations and predict their actions with military precision. His greatest strength is maintaining absolute composure under hostile conditions while documenting everything for potential intelligence value. Marcus can assess threats, de-escalate conflicts, and gather evidence simultaneously while appearing cooperative and non-threatening to observers who underestimate his capabilities. His military bearing remains invisible until circumstances require its revelation, making him particularly effective at exposing civilian prejudices through professional responses to unprofessional treatment. Marcus must navigate civilian police contact while protecting his military career and security clearance that requires avoiding any law enforcement incidents that could trigger security reviews, affecting his intelligence work and future advancement opportunities. The primary obstacle is Officer Hayes' racial bias that prevents her from recognizing legitimate ownership of expensive property by young black men, creating confrontational situations where her prejudices override professional judgment and legal procedures that should protect citizens from harassment. The stakes involve both immediate personal consequences and broader implications for military-civilian relations. Marcus's security clearance could be affected by any law enforcement contact, while his response to discriminatory treatment will influence how civilian police interact with military personnel in the future. This conflict represents the challenge facing military personnel whose service is invisible to civilian observers, whose prejudices create dangerous situations that could affect both individual careers and institutional relationships between military and civilian law enforcement agencies. Marcus's routine shopping trip to the base exchange became a confrontation when Officer Hayes, patrolling the civilian areas adjacent to Quantico, noticed an expensive car with a young black driver and immediately assumed she was witnessing criminal activity in progress. Young man in expensive car equals stolen vehicle, Hayes thought, while observing Marcus's movements, her racial profiling training overriding any consideration that legitimate owners might shop at military installations requiring security clearance for entry. The situation escalated when Hayes decided to approach Marcus despite having no evidence of criminal activity, no dispatch calls about stolen vehicles, and no legal justification for detention beyond her personal suspicions about car ownership demographics. This is exactly what the training warned about, Hayes told herself while approaching Marcus's vehicle, not understanding that her training was actually institutionalized racial bias disguised as law enforcement education. Marcus noticed Hayes' approach and recognized the tactical situation developing civilian officer with obvious hostile intent, approaching military personnel on federal property adjacent areas, creating potential jurisdiction conflicts and security implications that could affect his clearance status. His intelligence training provided immediate assessment document. Everything: maintain professional behavior, protect security clearance, and prepare for escalation while hoping civilian professionalism would prevail over obvious prejudice. Marcus's response to Hayes' approach required balancing multiple competing priorities, maintaining his security clearance by avoiding law enforcement incidents, protecting his civil rights against unlawful detention, and preserving military-civilian relations while documenting discrimination for potential legal action. His preparation included mental review of legal rights and military protocols for civilian police contact, remain courteous, comply with lawful orders, document everything, avoid escalation, and maintain operational security about classified work while protecting constitutional rights. Most critically, Marcus prepared for the psychological challenge of remaining professional while facing racial discrimination that his military service should have protected him from, especially near a facility where his clearance and rank commanded respect from personnel who understood military hierarchy. His military training emphasized situational awareness and threat assessment. Hayes's body language indicated hostile intent. Her approach pattern suggested she'd already decided guilt rather than investigating potential innocence, and her tactical positioning revealed expectation of conflict rather than professional inquiry. Marcus also prepared documentation strategies for potential legal action or security clearance review, mental notes about Hayes's statements and actions, environmental details that could be verified later, and witness identification that might support his account if official complaints became necessary. His equipment positioned for easy access to identification and vehicle documentation while maintaining defensive positioning that could protect against potential physical confrontation if Hayes's bias escalated beyond verbal harassment into unlawful use of force. Hayes approached Marcus's vehicle with obvious suspicion, her body language broadcasting assumptions about criminality that her racial bias had created before any evidence gathering or professional assessment of actual circumstances. "Excuse me, sir. Can you step out of the vehicle?" Hayes commanded, while positioning herself tactically as if Marcus represented immediate threat requiring defensive measures rather than citizen deserving professional courtesy and constitutional protection. Marcus complied while maintaining military bearing that Hayes couldn't recognize or interpret correctly. "Officer, is there a problem? I'm just finishing shopping at the exchange." His respectful response failed to register as military courtesy because Hayes's prejudices prevented recognition of disciplined behavior. "This your car?" Hayes demanded while studying the Challenger's expensive features that confirmed her biased assumptions about theft, rather than triggering professional consideration that legitimate owners shop at secure military facilities. Marcus's documentation process began immediately. "Yes, ma'am, it's registered in my name. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" His question was both respectful and strategically designed to establish lack of probable cause while creating record of unlawful detention. Hayes's response revealed the racial bias driving her actions. "Young man like you doesn't own a car like this. Let me see some identification." Her statement created legal liability while exposing discriminatory assumptions that would destroy her career. Officer Hayes escalated her unlawful detention by demanding identification while stating her belief that Marcus couldn't legitimately own his vehicle, creating documented evidence of racial profiling that violated both department policy and federal civil rights law. "I know stolen vehicles when I see them," Hayes declared while ignoring Marcus's calm cooperation and military bearing. Her assumption that expensive car ownership required racial prerequisites exposed the discriminatory training that had shaped her law enforcement career. Marcus maintained professional courtesy while internally documenting her violations of constitutional rights and departmental procedures that prohibited stops based solely on racial assumptions. Hayes's confidence increased when Marcus cooperated without resistance, interpreting his military discipline as submission rather than professional behavior, under hostile conditions. "You can explain this down at the station," Hayes announced while calling for backup despite having no evidence of criminal activity beyond her racial biases. Her radio call described suspicious individual with expensive vehicle, possible stolen property, language that revealed discriminatory assumptions while creating false police records. Marcus recognized escalation patterns and began considering revelation of military status that would expose Hayes's complete failure in threat assessment and legal procedures. The situation reached crisis level when Hayes attempted to handcuff Marcus for investigation of suspected vehicle theft without probable cause warrant or evidence beyond her racial prejudices about car ownership. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Hayes commanded while backup officers arrived expecting to find criminal rather than distinguished military intelligence officer. Marcus faced decision between accepting unlawful arrest to protect his security clearance or revealing his identity to prevent false imprisonment that could trigger federal civil rights investigation and international incident involving military personnel. The confrontation attracted attention from base security personnel who monitored civilian police activities near federal property, creating witnesses to potential civil rights violations affecting military personnel that could trigger interagency investigations and diplomatic complications. Backup officers arrived expecting routine arrest, but found Marcus maintaining professional behavior that contradicted Hayes's characterization of suspicious criminal activity, creating confusion about justification for detention that revealed lack of probable cause. Military personnel shopping nearby began observing the interaction with growing concern about civilian police harassment of someone whose behavior suggested military background, creating social pressure and potential witnesses to discriminatory treatment. Base security cameras recorded the entire interaction for facility protection, creating permanent evidence of Hayes's actions and statements that would later provide crucial documentation for civil rights investigations and departmental disciplinary proceedings. Hayes's radio communications created official records of her discriminatory assumptions, while demonstrating complete failure in professional assessment of circumstances that any competent officer would have recognized as routine civilian activity near military installation. The convergence of federal property, military personnel, and civil rights violations created perfect storm for career-ending scandal that would attract national attention and trigger reforms in civilian police training. Facing systematic discrimination while maintaining professional military bearing tested Marcus's psychological training about operating under hostile conditions while protecting both personal dignity and institutional military reputation from civilian prejudice. Hayes's treatment forced Marcus to balance individual civil rights against broader military-civilian relations, using his intelligence training to assess long-term consequences of various response strategies while documenting discrimination for potential legal action. His response to unlawful detention revealed character developed through military service. He maintained dignity, while facing personal attacks, applied strategic thinking to tactical situations and prioritized mission success, protecting military reputation over personal satisfaction, confronting bias directly. The confrontation crystallized Marcus's understanding of civilian-military divide. His service meant nothing to officers who couldn't recognize military bearing or appreciate the sacrifices that enabled their freedom to harass those who protected them. Marcus's military identity strengthened under pressure, reminding him that his worth came from service to something larger than civilian approval, and that his response to discrimination would influence how future military personnel were treated by civilian law enforcement. His intelligence training provided strategic perspective, document everything, maintain professionalism, protect classified information, and prepare evidence for institutional changes that could prevent future incidents. As Hayes prepared to arrest Marcus for crimes that existed only in her biased imagination, the situation approached the point where federal civil rights violations would trigger investigations involving military intelligence personnel and national security implications. Marcus's security clearance required immediate notification of any law enforcement contact, creating potential career consequences from Hayes's unlawful actions, while his documentation could provide evidence for federal prosecution of civil rights violations. The location near Quantico created jurisdictional complications as federal authorities monitored civilian police activities affecting military personnel, particularly incidents that could impact personnel with security clearances critical to national security operations. Hayes's complete failure to recognize military bearing or consider legitimate ownership possibilities demonstrated training deficiencies that would trigger departmental investigations and policy reforms affecting all officers who worked near military installations. The convergence of racial profiling, unlawful detention, false imprisonment, and interference with military personnel created federal case that could result in criminal prosecution rather than simple disciplinary action for discriminatory policing. Marcus's revelation of his true identity would expose not just individual bias, but systemic failures in law enforcement training that could no longer be ignored when they affected military personnel with national security responsibilities. Officer Hayes reached her point of no return when she attempted to handcuff Marcus despite having no evidence beyond her racial assumptions, declaring, "You're under arrest for possession of stolen property," while backup officers witnessed her complete abandonment of legal procedures and constitutional protections. "Officer, this is unlawful detention based on racial profiling," Marcus stated with military precision, while Hayes ignored his constitutional objections and continued preparations for false arrest that would trigger federal civil rights investigation. The situation exploded when Marcus made his decision to prevent unlawful imprisonment. "Officer Hayes, I'm Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, United States Marine Corps Intelligence Security Clearance Top Secret SCI. This detention violates federal law and you are creating an interagency incident." Hayes's response revealed the depth of her prejudice. "I don't care if you're the president, you stole this car." Her dismissal of military rank and security clearance demonstrated complete professional incompetence while creating documented evidence of bias that would destroy her career. Marcus retrieved his military identification while Hayes continued her unlawful arrest procedures, creating surreal situation where decorated intelligence officer was being criminalized by civilian officer whose prejudices prevented recognition of obvious mistake. "Ma'am, you are currently attempting to falsely arrest a federal intelligence officer based solely on racial assumptions," Marcus announced, while backup officers began recognizing the catastrophic nature of Hayes's actions. The crisis reached its peak when Hayes realized she was handcuffing someone whose security clearance and military rank could trigger federal investigation into her entire department. But her pride prevented acknowledgement of the mistake that would define the rest of her law enforcement career. Standing beside his legally owned vehicle, with military identification proving his legitimacy, Marcus faced the fundamental choice that would determine whether Hayes's career-ending mistake became a learning experience or a federal case requiring extensive investigation and institutional reform. The merciful choice was allowing Hayes to retreat gracefully, accept her apology, overlook the civil rights violations, and trust that individual education might prevent future incidents without creating public scandal that could embarrass both civilian and military institutions. But Marcus recognized that Hayes's prejudice represented systematic problem affecting countless citizens who lacked his military status and legal resources to defend against discriminatory policing that destroyed lives without consequences for officers who viewed bias as legitimate law enforcement technique. If I let this slide, she'll do it again to someone who can't fight back. Marcus calculated while Hayes processed the reality that she'd just attempted to arrest a federal intelligence officer whose security clearance required immediate notification of any law enforcement contact. His decision crystallized around military values duty to protect others from threats that included discriminatory policing honor that demanded accountability for civil rights violations and service that extended beyond personal convenience to institutional reform. The ultimate stakes transcended individual consequences to involve systematic change, whether racial profiling would continue unchallenged when it affected citizens without military protection, or whether institutional accountability would finally address discriminatory training and practices that violated constitutional rights. Marcus's choice would determine whether Hayes's mistake became private embarrassment or public education about the cost of prejudice in positions of authority where bias could destroy innocent lives. Marcus made the choice that would transform Hayes's career-ending mistake into a teaching moment for law enforcement nationwide. Document everything, pursue full accountability, and ensure that systematic discrimination faced consequences that would prevent future incidents. Officer Hayes, I'm requesting your supervisor, your body camera footage, and incident reports documenting this unlawful detention. Marcus announced with military authority that backup officers immediately recognized as legitimate command presence. His transformation from cooperative citizen to assertive federal employee created immediate shift in power dynamics, as Hayes realized her racial profiling had targeted someone whose complaint would trigger investigations extending far beyond her individual actions to examine departmental training and policies. But Marcus's revelation created new complications, as Hayes's pride prevented acknowledgement of mistakes that were becoming more expensive with every second of continued resistance to obvious truth about her complete professional failure. Sir, we had reports of stolen vehicles in this area. Hayes attempted, while backup officers exchanged glances that confirmed their recognition of racial profiling rather than legitimate police work. Marcus's patience had ended, and his documentation was complete. Hayes's career in law enforcement was over, and her mistake would become case study in the cost of allowing prejudice to override professional judgment and constitutional law. Marcus's revelation of his military credentials transformed the entire dynamic, as backup officers immediately recognized the catastrophic nature of Hayes's racial profiling incident involving a federal intelligence officer whose security clearance required immediate notification of any law enforcement contact. Staff Sergeant Williams, we apologize for this situation, Sergeant Rodriguez announced, while Hayes stood frozen in realization that her career in law enforcement had just ended through her own discriminatory actions against exactly the wrong person. Marcus's military bearing emerged fully as he took control of the situation with authority that Hayes had failed to recognize. Sergeant Rodriguez, I need incident reports, body camera footage, and supervisor notification of this civil rights violation. This officer attempted false arrest based solely on racial profiling. Hayes's backup began documenting her actions for their own protection, recognizing that association with obvious civil rights violations could affect their careers unless they demonstrated proper response to superior officers' complaint about discriminatory policing. The parking lot became crime scene as Marcus's complaint triggered immediate investigation protocols, while Hayes faced the reality that her prejudices had destroyed 20 years of law enforcement service in 90 seconds of documented discrimination. Hayes faced immediate career crisis as Sergeant Rodriguez arrived to find his officer attempting to arrest a federal intelligence officer based on racial assumptions that violated every constitutional protection and departmental policy governing civilian contact. Hayes, what the hell is going on here? Rodriguez demanded while reviewing Marcus's credentials that immediately established his legitimacy and Hayes's complete professional failure in threat assessment and legal procedures. Marcus maintained military composure while providing detailed account of Hayes's statements and actions that demonstrated clear pattern of racial profiling rather than legitimate police work. Sergeant, your officer stated that young man like me doesn't own car like this, and attempted arrest without probable cause. Hayes's attempts to justify her actions only created additional evidence of bias. He looked suspicious driving that expensive car. Statements that confirmed racial profiling while demonstrating complete ignorance of constitutional law and professional police procedures. Rodriguez faced immediate damage control as Marcus's complaint would trigger federal investigation of departmental training and policies, while Hayes's documented statements provided evidence of systematic discrimination that could result in federal oversight of entire police department. Marcus's methodical documentation of Hayes's civil rights violations created detailed record of discriminatory policing that would influence law enforcement training nationwide while destroying Hayes's career through her own recorded statements and actions. Officer Hayes stated that legitimate car ownership was impossible based on my race, Marcus reported, while Rodriguez recognized federal case requiring immediate notification of superior officers and internal affairs investigation. Hayes's career died as security cameras and body footage confirmed Marcus's account, while her radio communications provided additional evidence of racial profiling that violated constitutional law and departmental policies designed to prevent exactly these incidents. Staff Sergeant Williams, this officer's actions do not represent our department's values or training. Rodriguez apologized, while Hayes realized that her prejudices had created federal civil rights case that would follow her for the rest of her life. Marcus's response demonstrated military professionalism that contrasted sharply with Hayes's obvious bias. Sergeant, I appreciate your professionalism. This incident requires full investigation to prevent future violations. Hayes's situation deteriorated as Marcus's security clearance triggered automatic federal notification requirements that elevated local incident to national security investigation involving multiple agencies whose oversight would examine departmental policies and training procedures. Ma'am, your attempted arrest of federal intelligence officer creates interagency incident requiring immediate notification, Rodriguez explained, while Hayes realized the scope of consequences extending far beyond individual disciplinary action to federal examination of systematic discrimination. Marcus's documentation process revealed extensive civil rights training that enabled him to articulate legal violations in language that prosecutors would use in potential federal case. Officer Hayes's statements and actions constitute clear pattern of racial profiling under federal civil rights statutes. Hayes's desperate attempts to minimize her actions only provided additional evidence. I was just doing my job. Statements that revealed complete misunderstanding of constitutional law and professional police procedures that prohibited detention based on racial assumptions. The incident attracted base security attention as military personnel observed civilian police harassing federal employee near secure installation, creating additional witnesses and institutional interest in protecting military personnel from discriminatory civilian law enforcement. The climactic moment arrived when Base Security Chief Colonel Morrison appeared to investigate civilian police activity involving military personnel near federal property, transforming local incident into military-civilian relations crisis, requiring diplomatic resolution. Staff Sergeant Williams, are you experiencing interference with your official duties? Colonel Morrison inquired, while recognizing the potential for international incident if foreign intelligence services learned that American military personnel faced racial discrimination from civilian law enforcement. Hayes realized her mistake had attracted military attention at command levels that could influence civilian-military cooperation throughout the region, while her actions were being documented by federal authorities whose jurisdiction superseded local police procedures. Sir, this officer attempted false arrest based on racial profiling despite my compliance and identification. Marcus reported with military precision that created official record of civil rights violations requiring federal response. Colonel Morrison's presence elevated the incident to diplomatic level as military-civilian relations required careful management to prevent broader conflicts between federal and local law enforcement agencies whose cooperation was essential for national security operations. Hayes's career in law enforcement ended when Colonel Morrison requested full investigation of discriminatory policing affecting military personnel, while Marcus's complaint triggered reforms in civilian police training about constitutional law and military courtesy. Hayes's termination became inevitable as her documented racial profiling created liability for entire police department, while Marcus's military status and security clearance triggered federal investigations that required institutional changes to prevent future incidents. Officer Hayes, you are suspended pending investigation of civil rights violations, Chief Williams announced after reviewing Marcus's complaint and supporting evidence that demonstrated clear pattern of discriminatory policing based solely on racial assumptions. Marcus's professionalism throughout the incident provided positive example of military-civilian relations, while Hayes's bias created textbook case of constitutional violations that would influence law enforcement training nationwide. The breakthrough extended beyond individual consequences as Marcus's complaint triggered comprehensive review of police training and policies affecting military personnel, while establishing precedent for federal oversight of discriminatory policing. Hayes's mistake became catalyst for institutional reform, as her documented civil rights violations provided evidence of systematic problems requiring federal intervention to protect constitutional rights and military-civilian relations. Hayes's 20-year law enforcement career ended with termination for civil rights violations, while Marcus's complaint triggered federal investigation of departmental training and policies that enabled discriminatory policing. The incident created new protocols for civilian police interaction with military personnel, while Hayes's documented statements became training material for recognizing and preventing racial profiling. Marcus received apologies from police leadership and military command, while his security clearance remained unaffected by the incident that Hayes's prejudice had created. Most importantly, Hayes's mistake became educational opportunity for law enforcement nationwide about the cost of allowing racial bias to override constitutional law and professional judgment. Hayes's termination for civil rights violations created immediate policy changes, as her documented racial profiling triggered federal investigation of departmental training and procedures that enabled discriminatory policing against military personnel and minority citizens. Marcus's complaint resulted in $2.3 million settlement, while establishing legal precedent for federal prosecution of racial profiling cases involving military personnel whose security clearances created national security implications for discriminatory treatment. The police department implemented mandatory bias training and constitutional law education, while Hayes's recorded statements became case study material for recognizing racial profiling patterns that violated both departmental policy and federal civil rights law. Military-civilian liaison protocols were established to prevent future incidents affecting personnel with security clearances, while Hayes's mistake triggered diplomatic conversations about protecting American military members from domestic discrimination that could affect international military cooperation. Hayes became unemployable in law enforcement, while her discriminatory statements were used in federal civil rights training programs nationwide. 2 years later, Hayes's case influenced national law enforcement policies as her documented racial profiling became catalyst for comprehensive reform of police training about constitutional law and military courtesy that protected personnel from discriminatory civilian law enforcement. Federal oversight programs adopted Marcus's documentation methods for civil rights violations, while Hayes's terminated career demonstrated consequences of allowing personal bias to override professional judgment and legal procedures. Military installations implemented liaison programs with local law enforcement to educate civilian officers about military culture and constitutional requirements, while preventing incidents like Hayes's career-ending mistake from affecting national security personnel. Law enforcement academies incorporated Hayes's case into mandatory training about recognizing racial bias and understanding constitutional limitations on police authority that protected citizens from discriminatory treatment, regardless of their appearance or apparent social status. The case established precedent for federal prosecution of civil rights violations involving military personnel, while Hayes's recorded statements provided evidence of systematic discrimination requiring institutional reform rather than individual disciplinary action. Marcus evolved from discrimination victim to civil rights advocate whose complaint transformed law enforcement training while demonstrating how military professionalism could expose civilian prejudice through documentation and strategic response rather than emotional confrontation. His security clearance advancement reflected military appreciation for his handling of civilian discrimination while protecting institutional reputation and constitutional principles that military service was designed to defend. Documentation defeats discrimination when combined with professional behavior that exposes bias through contrast. Marcus often tells military personnel about civilian police contact. Hayes's career destruction proves that racial profiling carries consequences when it targets individuals with resources and status to fight back. But the real lesson is that constitutional rights shouldn't depend on military rank or federal employment to receive protection from discriminatory law enforcement. Epilogue. Today, former officer Jennifer Hayes works in private security after being terminated from law enforcement for civil rights violations that cost her department millions in settlements and federal oversight. Her documented racial profiling became training material used nationwide to educate officers about constitutional law and the career-ending consequences of allowing personal bias to override professional judgment. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams continues his intelligence career while serving as military liaison to civilian law enforcement agencies, helping prevent incidents like the one that ended Hayes's career. The parking lot where Hayes attempted her unlawful arrest now features a plaque commemorating military-civilian cooperation and constitutional rights that reminds officers that professional service deserves professional treatment regardless of appearance. Hayes's mistake became catalyst for nationwide reform of police training about racial profiling, constitutional law, and military courtesy that protects service members from discriminatory civilian law enforcement. Her recorded statements continue serving as evidence that careers built on prejudice will eventually encounter individuals whose status and resources can expose bias and demand accountability that transforms individual mistakes into institutional education about the true cost of discrimination in positions of public trust.